إنما هو التوحيد وتوحيد العبادة بالذات.
Okay, so this issue of obtaining certainty or near certainty. As relates to the Isnad system, the necessity for verifying a chain of narrators emerged with the third and fourth generations toward the end of the first and beginning of the second century Islamic centuries, or 7th and 8th centuries of the Common Era. Right? So this is that transmission that I was talking about, right? From an oral tradition to a written tradition, and the written tradition is going to be premised on the Isnad. Right? So if somebody of using this Isnad system, I gave two examples here, right? And this is from the early written records that we have, from the time of the third or fourth generation, right? Middle of the second Islamic century, the 8th century of the Common Era. The Sirah of Ibn Ishaq, Sirah Rasulullah, written by this man Ibn Ishaq. We'll talk about him more later on. He dies the year 150 of the Hijrah. Right? So he's already has written an extensive biography of the Prophet. Right? So very active in the early 2nd century. And then, of course, we have the well-known work of Imam Malik ibn Anas, the Muwatta. Right? And Malik dies year 179 of the Hijrah, right? 795 of the Common Era. Right? And so here we have the Sirah of Ibn Ishaq, which is a Sirah, is a historical biographical work, and we have the legal writings of the Muwatta of Imam Malik. And when you look at the Sirah of Ibn Ishaq and the Muwatta of Imam Malik, you see the Isnad system. They're using it fully. Right? It's not perfected yet. It's in a process of being perfected. But you will always see, Ibn Ishaq to a lesser extent, but he gives the Isnad. He said, I heard from so-and-so, who heard from so-and-so, who heard from so-and-so. He gives the names of these people. Right? Sometimes he's a little bit lax. Right? There's some criticism of him that we'll talk about later on, but questioning some of the reports that he gives. But when we come to Imam Malik, we see the same thing. Right? He's reporting from his teachers, people who were before him, right? And they're very close to the time of Prophet Muhammad. Right? And so there's 2 or 3 generations between Imam Malik and Prophet Muhammad. There's only 2 or 3 generations between Ibn Ishaq and Prophet Muhammad and the Sahaba. Right? And we know the Sahaba lived, mostly in the middle of the 1st century. Right? But you have some of the Sahaba living, towards the end of the 1st century of the Hijrah. Right? So you have a transition, of Sahaba slowly dying off, a 2nd generation emerging, the Tabi'un, also a 3rd generation emerging, within that 1st century, going into the 2nd century. So it's never clear cut. One whole generation dies, another generation starts. You have overlapping. Okay? And so when we look at the Muwatta of Imam Malik, we see there's 2 or 3 people, sometimes 4, but depending on how many teachers there were between Prophet Muhammad and the time Imam Malik is writing this down. But as I said, the Isnad system is only in its early development. Right? And we know that sometimes Imam Malik had reported something and he skips a generation, right? Or sometimes he just goes to a Sahaba and says, the Sahaba so-and-so. We know that Imam Malik didn't hear from the Sahaba. He didn't meet the Sahaba, so he can't report directly from them. So he's not using the Isnad system completely and perfectly and accurately. Right? But he's using it, and we see it's being applied. Right? And also one of the issues is that he's so close to the time of the companions and the Tabi'un, right, that there wasn't this heavy emphasis on being so precise. Okay? Because the other issue that's coming up is, of course, as Islam spreads, right, into Persia and Central Asia, into Syria, Iraq, Palestine, into Egypt and beyond, you start to get non-Arab converts to Islam. And this is going to complicate the situation. Right? Because these converts are not Arab, they don't know Arabic, right? They certainly don't know anything about Arab society, Arab culture, they don't know anything about Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. They don't know anything about the religion. They have to learn from scratch. Right? And what you also see is a lot of fabricated reports start to emerge. Right? And as I said, this is one of the major problems of the hadith, fabricated reports, right, that start to circulate. Right. So anyway, we have early examples of the use of the Isnad system in the works of the Ibn Ishaq and Malik ibn Anas. Right? As I've been saying now, anything that any issues that we cover, right, will be similar here. And the rise of the Isnad system corresponds to the expansion of the Ummah and the inclusion of the non-Arab Muslims who knew nothing about the life of Muhammad Sallallahu and the companions. However, this also meant that there was a sharp increase in the weak and fabricated reports about them. Thus, there was a growing need to verify these reports in order to ascertain the authentic narrations from Muhammad ﷺ and his companions. Right? So, as we move into the 2nd century, right, we see more and more effort on the part of scholars of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah putting emphasis on wanting to verify the narrators in the chain of narration. Right? Who are these people who are passing on this report? Okay. And this was due not only to the increased number of fabricated reports, right, coming from the non-Arabs who are bringing their own old religions, old cultural practices, not giving up those old practices, absorbing aspects of Islam, but not fully. And so you start to get all these fabricated weak reports, right, about Muhammad. You also have fabricated weak reports emerging because of theological or political issues that begin to divide the Ummah. Right? And so when we look at Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, it's going to be defined in contrast with certain groups that begin to deviate. Right? So for example, an early group that we know of is the Mu'tazila. Right? And they basically rejected the hadith. They were sometimes called a rationalist group, right, of theologians. They had certain interpretation of the Quran, certain interpretation about the nature of Allah, right? And they, for the most part, rejected the hadith. They said, we can't trust these hadith. And this is early in the 2nd century of Islam. Right? So you already have groups that are saying, we can't follow the hadith. Then you have other problems with the hadith. So for example, with the famous scholar Abu Hanifa, right, who also dies the year 150, who was active in Kufa in southern Iraq. He very cautiously used hadith, right, because he did not have access to the authentic narrations. He was also in the midst of the time period in the region where there are a lot of fabricated reports, and as a scholar of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, Abu Hanifa was being very cautious. If a hadith came to him, a narration about Prophet Muhammad ﷺ came to him, and he couldn't verify the chain of transmission, he would have to reject this. Right? And he was doing what was proper to do. Okay? But this also created, in a sense, forced him to interpret the Quran, interpret law, and give legal opinions with a smaller number of hadith. Right? However, in that same 2nd century, we do know that the definitive argument about using the Sunnah, right, and authentic hadith in all aspects of Islamic discourse was put forth by Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi, Imam al-Shafi, who dies 204 of the Hijrah, right, the year 820. So he's functioning, he's operating, he's teaching, right, in the second half of the 2nd century of the Hijrah. And this is very important because Imam Shafi clearly defines what the scholars of Ahl Sunnah were saying, right? From the Sahaba to the Tabi'un, to the Tabi'ut Tabi'in, and he puts it in very clear language, very powerful arguments. He lays it out in his written works that we know of. And the point here is that he says the Sunnah, right, is the necessary component to the Quran. In the Sunnah, he refers to all the verses of the Quran that talk about the Al-Kitab wal-Hikmah, And he says Al-Kitab is the Quran, and the Hikmah, the wisdom, is the Sunnah. And so he puts forth very carefully constructed, elaborate arguments with evidence after evidence showing that it's absolutely necessary to use the Sunnah, use the authentic Hadith, to elaborate everything that's in the Quran, whether theology or law or whatever. So Imam Shafi plays a critical role in establishing the need for the Sunnah, and therefore the need to have authenticated Isnad.
Did Imam Shafi travel a lot more than to gather this information, because he was able, seems like he didn't come too much after Imam Abu Hanifa, but yet
all of the scholars, all of the Muslims of those early periods did travel. Right? Abu Hanifa traveled, Imam Malik traveled. Right? But Abu Hanifa was primarily in southern Iraq and Kufa, in that region. Imam Malik, we do know, of course, was primarily in Medina. Right? And later on, we do the fiqh, we'll look at some of the differences in the usul of fiqh, the principles of the fiqh, because they do come up with different methodology for determining the law, right? Giving fatwa, giving legal rulings. Right? And it had to do with where they were, the time that they were living, and the reports that they were receiving. Right? And we do know that Abu Hanifa had a body of writings, right? And he himself didn't write very much. Most of what we know about Abu Hanifa's theology and his fiqh come from his students who wrote things down. So Abu Hanifa was still sort of in that generation where most of what he said was from memory, from oral transmission. But we also know that his students wrote, about his teachings, but they also changed or corrected or updated many of his opinions. Some scholars say up to 50% of Abu Hanifa's opinions were changed by his students. Right? I can't think of the names of him. It's skipping my name is Muhammad al-Shaybani and Yusuf. The names are skipping my but he had two famous students, and they traveled. They met with Imam Shafi'i. They studied the Hadith, and they came to realize that the methodology Abu Hanifa was using with limited number of Hadith had to be altered when they came in contact with authentic Hadith. So what becomes the Hanafi madhab is a whole separate issue. But yeah, all of these scholars travel, they learn from different people depending on the time period and the circumstances, because a lot of times, because of political problems, they could not travel. Right? And we know that a lot of these scholars faced confrontation with the political leaders. Right? Abu Hanifa, right, was arrested toward the end of his life. He was put under pressure, to do things by the government that were in place at that time. Right? And many of these scholars simply refused to cooperate with the political authority. We know, Imam Malik was arrested and beaten because he wouldn't agree to what the caliph at the time wanted him to do. So there were all kinds of limitations of what some of these people could do. Right? And we know, many stories of the scholars of that time period. Right? Others that I haven't even gotten to yet, but Sufyan al-Thawri, Sufyan ibn Uyayna, they were all great scholars of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, but they were also all, avoiding or opposing political decisions that were being made. But we do know that Imam Shafi, he had traveled to Baghdad. He had met with different people, but he was mostly in Egypt. Right? He's well known being a scholar from Egypt. So there was travel. There were correspondence between them. So they are in contact with each other. Okay? and they are developing their ideas. So Imam Shafi, through his work, through his travels, through his experiences with other scholars, puts together this elaborate argument for the Sunnah. And he really becomes the first to fully put forth the idea of the Sunnah. Abu Hanifa accepted the idea of the Sunnah, but he had limited access. Imam Malik accepted the idea of the Sunnah, but he was focused mostly on Medina and the practices of the people of Medina. So Imam Shafi emerges, the third of the four great scholars. Ahmad ibn Hanbal is going to be the next. But he's the one who puts together this idea that the Quran and the Sunnah are a necessity, and in order to know the Sunnah, you have to have an authenticated Isnad.